I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a show where we do crazy things like debate, do nuclear weapons bring order, or do they bring disorder to our mad, 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 mad world? This might seem like a very abstract topic, but the last couple of years have actually seen the nuclear issue more back on the table. We have Putin's nuclear threats over Ukraine. Even Germany, one of the most anti-nuclear countries in Europe, a conservative, largely pacifist nation, is having a debate about whether there should be a Eurobomb. And Keir Starmer said just last month in a Daily Mail article that his commitment to the UK's nuclear weapons is in fact unshakable and absolute. And that's quite a change from where Labour had been at in certain moments in the post-World War II period where it was against Trident and that the hard left in the UK was anti-nuclear. This is, after all, the Disorder program. So what I'd like to investigate is, do nuclear weapons give an opportunity to create order by creating mutually assured destruction and mutual deterrence? Or does nuclear weapons, and particularly more states acquiring them, create a potential proliferation cycle which can get out of control and foster disorder? Who better to talk about this topic with me than Jane Kinnemont? She has worked with former security officials and diplomats from across Europe who share a common interest in preventing nuclear war. And this is in her work with the European Leadership Network, which brings together more than 400 current, former, and future leaders to reduce nuclear risks and prevent conflict. Jane has 2 decades of expertise covering the Middle East. She's worked at the Economist Intelligence Unit and Chatham House, and for an organization with a very creepy name that's actually not that creepy at all, called the Elders. It's a group of leaders and peacemakers with Nobel Prizes coming out of their ears who are not running a conspiracy. Welcome to Disorder, Jane.
Thank you, Jason. Great to be here.
Jane, before we jump into this topic, as I've gotten to know more about you, I have this perverse feeling that if I was born a woman in Scotland, I might have ended up as you. I think we're of a similar vintage, and we both ended up studying the Middle East because of the 9/11. How did this all shake out in your case?
Well, when 9/11 happened, I thought I was going to be a music journalist because I really loved music and I loved writing, and I also loved getting free tickets to go to see bands and things like that. But I was studying politics and economics and philosophy and doing a summer internship in New York City, and I found myself accidentally an eyewitness to 9/11 because I was running late for work, having been out the night before to see Money Mark, the keyboardist from the Beastie Boys, and I was behind schedule. And going to the Tube in Greenwich Village, I saw the first plane hit the World Trade Center.
So you weren't just there. Greenwich Village, for our listeners, this is south of Union Square. This is truly southern Manhattan, right near the trade centers.
Absolutely. And there was a big crowd there. And actually, I think people's reaction was very similar to what it would be today in our more social media obsessed age, which was everybody was standing there taking photographs. And then I got on the Tube to go to work and got evacuated as the towers were about. So I was working in Brooklyn, trying to get out of Manhattan. And then that proved not to be possible. We were evacuated. And that was basically just before the whole building started to come down. So I had, what probably later turned out to be a formative experience of running for my life with a huge crowd, hearing this noise behind me without knowing what it would be, except that it was very, very, very bad. And that turned out to be the towers coming down. I was amazed by the resilience of the human spirit at that time. I was also amazed by how petty some people were, like my boss, who said that if I'd come to work on time, I wouldn't have had that experience. And I could have stayed out in Brooklyn and focused on work, instead of being cut off in Manhattan, where the phones weren't working. And everyone's focus then was on trying to reach their loved ones, but New York was cut off. But what you did see was then this huge pylon in the media of people called terrorism experts who said, this was the beginning of the continuation of the endless war between Islam and the West and all of this. I didn't know very much about this, but I come from Glasgow, as you mentioned, and we have our own long and distinguished history of sectarianism.
Celtic versus Rangers.
That is one of the deepest issues you can get into. It's just a conflict that will never be resolved, and I say that half joking because it's funny that this sectarian conflict now plays out mostly in a football rivalry. But, when my parents were growing up, it was extremely tough to deal with people from the other side of the sectarian divide, and they come from the different sides of the sectarian divide, so it was a huge controversy when my mum and dad got married. But I grew up with this sense that these divides are usually based on ignorance. That's the kind of lesson that I've taken away from it, because there were a lot of myths among Catholics about what Protestants were like. There were a lot of myths among Protestants about what Catholics were like. And my experience has been to come from a society where not everything is fine, but really these issues are being left behind in the past. So I had this sense that, maybe with the Middle East, a lot of this stuff is BS that people love to write op-eds about, but maybe if I learn more about this part of the world, I can understand how people can just get on, right? And I mean, that hasn't quite worked out, but I think there's some truth in it.
I think that very similarly to me, you got into the field thinking that change to the better was feasible, and that if policymakers and the populace understood issues and had more expert advice, they would want to be more understanding and move to the good, and we could have better policies and a better outcome. So where did our optimism go, Jane? This is the key question. And maybe part of it has to do with everything that has gone wrong and gotten us into this place where in 2024 we have to debate, could there be nuclear war and a nuclear strike? I certainly never thought that we would be here. And I want to kind of problematize first, can nuclear weapons really be used? It's important to keep in mind that they were only used once in human history over the skies of Japan, and only a couple of months after they were first invented. And people didn't really understand the extent of the sheer human tragedy and atrocity that would be caused in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In fact, there was a bit of a cover-up because Americans, when they occupied Japan, didn't want the Japanese to know how bad it had been, what had been done. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
No one understood the true human implications, as well as the environmental and cancer and whatever. And now, for pretty much 75 years, since we know how bad they are, not even crazies like Putin or Kim Jong-il have used them. So, you study this question. Are nuclear weapons usable?
So nuclear weapons are super interesting as part of looking at defense and security, because unlike most forms of warfare, most weapon systems that we look at, we have almost no empirical data to go on. And so while this is a hugely important topic that lots of people apply their brains to, a lot of it is guesswork, is psychology. People use a lot of game theory, but ultimately there are a lot of unknowns. What we do know is, as you say, nuclear weapons haven't been used again. And one reason for that is self-interest, that between the two countries that have the most nuclear weapons, there has been that mutual assurance of destruction that means that basically nukes are a suicide pact. But there is also the taboo issue that neither of those countries have used nukes against other countries that couldn't fight back in the same way since Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
But I think that we have that precedent, unfortunately. It's not the happiest precedent. And I do defend the use then. Probably more people would have died otherwise. And the firebombing of Japan maybe actually caused more deaths than nuclear weapons. But I do think that that precedent does sit on American strategic thinkers.
And there is a historical debate that can't really be proven because it's about counterfactuals, but about whether, those weapons were needed to win the war. And I think part of the issue is that both the US and Russia have had big conventional armies. So does China. So the use case for nuclear weapons is less important. In both of their doctrines, they position nuclear weapons as weapons that would be used if there was an existential threat to their state. But frankly, if they want to go out and get involved in military adventures, they have other tools, whereas you'd be in a really different position with a small country that doesn't have a big army but does have a nuclear weapon. But what do you mean by using nuclear weapons? Well, obviously, people haven't detonated them since 1945, but Putin, for example, has found that the weapons are quite useful as a tool of coercion. And so, that is clearly what we've seen in Ukraine, and it has worked. I mean, he hasn't been able to...
Really?
There has been a lot of dancing around as countries try to figure out where the red lines are. How much can they supply Ukraine with weapons before triggering some kind of response from Russia? And that's still unclear. That could become more of an issue again if Russia was on the back foot conventionally. But because actually they haven't been facing defeat at a conventional level, you haven't really got to that point where Russia's pushed into a corner. But definitely it has had some deterrent effect, and that's making other countries look and say, nukes are more useful than we thought to have in their back pocket.
Well, I've always thought that nukes are useful as a regime security guarantee. They don't help you in fighting a war. But I want to push back here. If I understood you correctly, you think that the war in Ukraine has taken a different trajectory conventionally, i.e., in the trench battles in Donbass or in what is or is not happening around Kherson because of Putin's nuclear arsenal and his nuclear threats. Could you sketch for us what has happened differently?
There has been a ceiling on the level of Western intervention, I believe, because of fears of things escalating to a nuclear level. I don't think it has had the desired effect on intimidating the Ukrainians. I mean, Putin might have thought that wielding nuclear threats would convince the Ukrainians to surrender, and that hasn't happened because Ukrainians seem to be making the calculation that it's existential for them anyway. But it has influenced how Ukraine is discussed in the West, and particularly whether there could be any chance of putting NATO boots on the ground. Biden's been quite clear that if there was a shooting war that involved American and Russian troops, that could escalate to a World War III level. Now, we don't know for sure if today's America would put boots on the ground in Ukraine anyway, but they might be more amenable to other NATO countries going in to help.
So we're kind of talking a lot about this issue of threats. How about the knock-on effects of Putin's threats? Because threats have a meaning. And on the podcast, we talk a lot about the psychology of negotiation and the psychology of game theory. I think that those threats are very important. So how can these threats be countered?
One of the interesting things has been that China really did seem uncomfortable with Putin's nuclear threats. And I think it does reflect that China and Russia have quite different positions on renegotiating the world order, where, maybe Russia wants to blow it up, but China kind of wants to run it. That's a simplistic generalization. But, China, its focus is on building up its own nuclear arsenal and probably trying to get parity or even exceed the US. It doesn't want the rest of the world to see nuclear weapons as a present danger that need to be wiped out. And it probably doesn't want, an actual nuclear war to evolve in the vicinity. So
this gets at the idea that we've debated a lot on this podcast. Is Russia the disorderer and China is, it's a hesitant order, maybe in its near abroad, but they don't want global disorder. I think that the Chinese hesitance to even hear nuclear threats may indicate, of course, they don't want shit to get too bad because they're getting wealthier and more powerful every year.
That's right. And they've got nothing to gain from a nuclear war between Russia and Ukraine. So it does seem, publicly and privately, that China suggested that Russia might rein in the overt nuclear threat. Now, what has happened is that Putin has kind of found ways to do those threats a little bit more subtly. So you've seen quite a lot of academics and think tankers, our equivalents in Russia who are close to the Kremlin, suddenly writing crazy articles saying maybe nuclear bombs need to be used, otherwise they won't be a credible threat anymore. And you've also seen Russia exiting arms control negotiations, taking strange steps, like they're part of there's a global treaty on banning nuclear tests, which isn't enforced because it doesn't have enough ratifications. And lots of countries have signed it but not ratified it. This is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty.
Oh, okay.
Really weird bit of international law because it doesn't have legal force, but everybody sticks by it, which is really interesting. And Russia was one of the countries that had both signed it by the government and ratified it by the Duma. And then as part of their nuclear saber rattling a few months ago, they got the Duma to unratify it. And international lawyers have looked at this and said, what does it mean? Are you in the treaty or not in the treaty? Completely unclear. But it seems like a slightly more subtle way of signalling we might do a nuclear test without getting into very risky territory.
And after the break, we'll hear about different scenarios where a nuclear bomb might be used. Let's talk about the scenarios in which nuclear states might actually use their arsenals. Most nuclear states say that they would use them in an existential threat, but there also could be blackmail. Could you talk us through a scenario, say, where Putin is on the back foot? He has some protests at home, a lot of soldiers are not going to fight, and then maybe he loses in rapid succession some towns in Donbass. How could this lead to an actual situation where the quote-unquote academic debate we're having now becomes real?
Well, this is exactly a scenario that people were gaming out, especially in sort of late 2022, when the risk looked a bit higher, and it could still come back. Russia has a lot of so-called tactical nuclear weapons that are designed for use in battlefields. They could look to detonate one in a part of Ukraine. Now, then you get into lots of questions about, is that going to destroy areas that you want to occupy? What's the blowback going to be? Another scenario has been people suggesting, what if they tested a bomb in the air over the Black Sea with limited casualties, although huge kind of pollution fallout? But the scenario that...
I like the Black Sea. I don't want them to do that. I want to go to Batumi.
There you go. If I find a way to pass that on to Russia.
Well, they want to, because Batumi is the Russian Riviera, as is Abkhazia. So it would be very, very weird to do that.
There's a lot of reasons to not use a nuclear weapon against your neighbours. You can make analyses, but there's always a bit of an unknown about what certain leaders might be prepared to do. I think that the scenario that sort of Western military planners have been looking at has been that if a nuclear bomb was used, it might be used to force an end to the war on Russia's terms. So no one thinks that Russia has any desire to get into an escalatory spiral, but that because no nuclear weapon has been used in most people's lifetimes, even using a small-scale nuclear weapon would be a game changer and would put Ukraine on the back foot. Now, there might be other things that could be done as well with chemical or biological weapons. There are all sorts of kind of horrible scenarios. But this is the most plausible one that Western governments have been talking about, that it would be about nuclear weapons and the threat of further escalation being used as part of a political strategy. So then there's been a big debate about what should the US say? Should the US then say, if Russia used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, what would the US do? And would it be credible for the US to say they would bring nuclear weapons into this scenario when Ukraine is not in NATO? And it seems that the messages that have been sent in the past have been essentially saying to the Russians, we have a lot of options to retaliate in a conventional way. For example, in the Black Sea, sinking Russian ships, that the US has not done much with Ukraine beyond sending weapons, but that if a nuclear bomb was introduced, all bets would be off, but that response could be conventional rather than nuclear.
I want to pivot here and have us think about, does having a bomb actually allow you to bend your adversaries to your will? Because we've seen two ongoing conflicts where one state is nuclear and its opponent is not, but the nuclear state is not necessarily winning the conflict. Russia doesn't seem to be able to make Ukraine bend to its will when Ukraine doesn't have nukes, and Russia has so many that it could literally obliterate every square inch of Ukraine and leave no Ukrainian citizens alive, but it doesn't make it able to win the war. And Israel obviously has nuclear supremacy both over Iran and Gaza, but the existence of these nukes do not allow them to defeat Hamas in any way. So what really is the use of having these nukes in these kind of conflicts?
There is this paradox in the literature on nuclear deterrence, which says that nuclear weapons can give you what's called strategic stability, which means basically not having World War III. But they can even encourage sub-strategic instability. So this literature has come up particularly around India and Pakistan, where the fact they're both nuclear powers probably keeps a lid on things, but it doesn't stop conflict sometimes erupting. And, that is especially true when there is some kind of role for non-state actors, or when there's deniable non-state actors that are backed by a state, because you can't really deter terrorist groups with nuclear weapons in the same way. So there are a lot of different levels of conflict. Nuclear weapons are really designed for the last resort and the existential threat. And they're expensive. They take a lot of signalling in terms of the credibility. They're certainly not a model for solving all options. And there are some who think that one of the issues with the UK having its nuclear deterrent is that it might have created some complacency. It might have contributed to the sense that we don't need to invest so much in the conventional military because our conventional military is there for expeditionary warfare and no one's going to come and get us at home because we have the deterrent. Whatever you have in place, if you have the confrontation, your adversaries are going to work out ways around those thresholds, And that is obviously what we're seeing with the hybrid warfare of today.
So to kind of simplify this very nuanced and complex answer that you just gave, obviously nukes are not a substitute for conventional capabilities. It is possible that, say, Britain, more so than France, has lost its appetite to maintain its armed forces for conventional conflicts like helping the Ukrainians or even expeditionary counterinsurgency things that might come up. And maybe that's because of the reliance on the nuclear threat. And it's not clear if we look at conflicts like India and Pakistan that both sides having nuclear arms really means that they can't have limited conflict or proxy conflict. I want to come back to Ukraine. I have long maintained that we have not done right by the Ukrainians on the nuclear issue. The Cold War didn't end with one massive peace conference the way that the Versailles Conference ended World War I, or we had the San Francisco Conference that established the UN after World War II. But to my mind, the most important treaty of the post-Cold War world is the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. And in this moment, the Ukrainians give up not necessarily their nuclear weapons, but the Soviet nuclear weapons that were on their territory. And we guaranteed them that, what do you know, if you do this, we will make sure that your territory, your sovereign territory, is inviolate. And I see that as beyond the regular territorial integrity norm that exists as being part of the UN Charter. And yet, when Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, we didn't really do anything. So we let our Budapest Memorandum obligations go essentially unanswered. And even Bill Clinton said that he regretted persuading Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons. So what is the lesson that this teaches people about the use of nukes?
This is a fundamental problem, and there have been quite a number of Ukrainians saying we shouldn't have given up the nukes and we'd never have been attacked if we had. Now, again, bunch of counterfactuals there. Russia would still have many more nukes. As you say, they were Soviet nukes, not necessarily Ukrainian nukes. But nonetheless, there is this clear sense that we were cheated. We made this agreement signed by the great powers of the world and we were cheated. And so one thing that does is it shakes the norms about nuclear non-proliferation. Another thing that it does is make a future peace treaty more difficult. I mean, there's a bunch of obstacles to a peace treaty, of course, and it's not clear that Russia wants to negotiate one. But there is a problem that applies to both Russia and Ukraine, which is if we could reach an agreement, how on earth could we believe it? Who would police it? Who would implement it? And Ukrainians will say, we've had this experience of having the signatures of all these powers, and what has it led to? Now, you will hear, for example, some Americans saying, we have stuck by the treaty because we provided arms. But that's not what people thought they were signing.
I can't defend American policy on this point. Merely giving arms after Ukraine has suffered a full-scale invasion has not in any way allowed us to say that we have honored our treaty obligations. And it does seem to me that if you have nukes, someone else can't overthrow your regime. And that the India, Pakistan, and North Korea examples and Libya example all prove this, which is that Libya and Iraq, when they had chemical weapons and other programs but didn't get their nukes, could be overthrown. We're not doing any regime change on North Korea. And the Iranians have every right, to my mind, to want to nuclearize because the way that they look at the world, and these are not dumb people, and they don't just engage in theological reasoning. I think that they are smart and potentially very evil calculators. And they're like, our own people want to overthrow us. We've seen that in the 2009 Green Revolution. We've seen that with the Mahsa Amini protests. And again, those are with good reason. The Iranian people have every right to want to overthrow them. But then they know if we get nukes, we can stay in power. So that's a very dangerous precedent. How do we deal with that?
So I think it's true up to a point. I mean, I think countries are interested in nuclear weapons partly for regime security, and that's definitely what you see in the case of North Korea. And in the case of North Korea, it's probably worked. But I think we're also in a time that there's less appetite for regime change. I don't think that the US, for all the rhetoric that there are among various US politicians who might come back to power, I don't think they really want to bite off regime change in Iran because I think they are afraid of the disorder that would ensue without seeing a clear pathway for a united Iranian opposition to take over. And I think that's just a reaction against what has happened in Iraq and what has happened in Libya. That there's a kind of generational reaction that is, we just don't know where regime change will go. And that they might not like Iran, but if they could find a way to contain or accommodate Iran, reducing the regional disruption is ultimately going to be much more important to the US than standing up for Iranian freedom of speech or women's rights to wear what they like or things like that, which are always going to be secondary concerns.
Why don't we talk about non-proliferation risks? I know that this is an issue that you've done a lot of work on.
Sure. So I think it's also an issue that is fundamentally changing because people's assumptions about global security are being rocked by the question of where is the role of the US in the future? And that's being accelerated by the prospect of Trump too, with what Trump's saying openly about NATO. But even if Trump does not win the election, there is this sense that the US doesn't want to be the world's policeman indefinitely, and US voters don't really see it as rewarding. So why is that relevant to nuclear non-proliferation? Well, for some time, it has been so-called rogue states that are really, or regimes that fear being changed, who think nukes might be the way to get the upper hand. And beyond that, there has been general acceptance internationally that nuclear proliferation is undesirable, and virtually every country in the world has signed up to a treaty to prevent it. But that has been in the context of a world where many, many countries have believed that they are under highly, highly credible US security guarantees, and that for NATO countries, there's an explicit nuclear umbrella as part of that, and that for other countries like South Korea or Japan, that's less explicit, but there is a sense that the security is underwritten by the US. In the Gulf too, ever since the liberation of Kuwait, there was this sense that security is underwritten by the US. And now everyone is thinking through, do we have it in writing? And do we know that a president would back it up? And so what you've been seeing more recently is talk of maybe we should get nuclear weapons coming from Saudis and even coming from South Koreans. And then the latest thing has been this debate in Germany, which is striking because it's part of a general upheaval in German foreign policy thinking from being very conservative and generally quite pacifist to looking around for new solutions. But it is a sign of the times, and it's a sign of insecurity in the security guarantees from the US and the future of NATO.
There are so many interesting and critical themes that will resonate with the orderers out there. It is the essence of the decline of American hegemony and the certitudes of the old ways of thinking that leads to this desire to proliferate. Before, you knew there was an American security umbrella. You know that the American unipolar or hyperpower would leave the world in a certain way, an ordered way. And now if you don't know that the Americans are going to come to defend you, you might as well get your own nukes. And I have to say, I empathize with that perspective.
You can see where it's coming from, this context of fragmentation and this sense that there's a need to be more self-reliant, and maybe having your own nuclear bomb is the ultimate self-reliance. At the same time, Russia has many more nuclear warheads than the UK and France combined. So kind of mathematically or numerically, you can't have every European state trying to have enough nuclear bombs to deter Russia. It doesn't really work. But I think it's indicative of the disorder that you talk about and the problems. But I don't see how the solution could be trying to get some kind of nuclear parity with a superpower, and there would be such huge opportunity costs to that. I think maybe it's easier to find the political will to make sure NATO sticks together. Who knows if the EU can manage it? I mean, there have been some suggestions about an EU bomb, which I find kind of amazing because, one of the issues that comes up about nuclear decision-making is that if you detect an incoming attack and you were the president of the US, they estimate that the president might have just 7 minutes to decide whether to retaliate before it's too late. We cannot imagine the EU making a decision of any kind in 7 minutes.
It's a fundamental symptom of disorder that states are questioning U.S. security guarantees, and the very nature of the nuclear non-proliferation system only works when there's trust. But we see that we're in a world where international law is flouted, norms are no longer paid attention to, and people are beginning to question the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So I can empathize. I really can empathize with a German leader and a South Korean one, partially a Saudi one, but definitely a South Korean one who's like, we need to have our own nuclear deterrence. I'm not sure that size matters as much as you're saying. Yeah, the Russians may have more, but if you have one or two, you can fight back, even if, the French or British were not going to do it on your behalf. And even if Trump is being like, I'm not going to defend you. If you're a country and you have a few nukes, you can attack the Kremlin. I completely get the logic. There's a game theory logic to have some, or to even have a threat of having them. People don't know that you have them. It can create the mutually assured destruction. All of which comes back to where I wanted to lead off. And it's really important for us to flesh out into the open for our listeners areas where we might see things slightly differently. And then we can agreeably disagree on those areas.
Absolutely.
I have been on the fringe of the American strategic debate in that there is no negative to Germany or South Korea getting nukes. It would be unbelievably hypocritical, I think, for American or Western policymakers to say, well, we can have them because we were in first, but Germany and South Korea can't have them. I think the issue is all about coordination. Do you know what I mean? That if we can do these things in a choreographed way, these are the steps, you fill out this form, we have a council meeting, we meet in this way, these are the criteria. I want to see an ordered world. And nuclear deterrence and mutually assured destruction can be part of that order, but it has to be something whereby we can work together with the Russians on the Arctic, and we agree that at the International Space Station, no one's health care is being threatened because the Russians are not going to send up their medications for them.
Right.
It's all, for me, about an ordered world. And because there are nukes, and because we have satellites, and we have the International Space Station, we all live on this planet together. We've got to find a way to get along.
So I'm going to start by agreeing with you before I disagree with you massively. But, I agree we've all got to get along. And I agree it is hypocritical that nuclear armed states say no, others can't get them. But I don't think there's any way to say, okay, we're going to pick Germany and South Korea will get them, but we'll make sure that nobody else does. When, Russia and China also have the ability to transfer that nuclear technology to others.
We don't need to transfer to Germany. They could just make their own. They don't need anyone's help.
So we would be making a decision then to basically unwind the non-proliferation treaty that we do have, which has been the cornerstone of non-proliferation for a long time. And that treaty, it is under some strains because it's got 3 bits. So 1, no one else gets nukes. 2, the nuclear powers will sort of agree to talk about disarming at some point with no fixed end date. 3, everyone has the right to peaceful uses of nuclear technology, of which, of course, the main interest now is in nuclear energy. And that's where you get the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency.
The IAEA.
IAEA, which brings in something beyond trust. There's an old Cold War arms control slogan, trust but verify. And what the IAEA does is verify that nuclear energy plants are not being used for nuclear weapons. And they can check that if they have the access. This is the big dance going on around Iran at the moment, is kind of how much access do they have and where and so on. But their role is really, really important. So there is this bargain, and that is part of what has stopped more countries getting nuclear weapons. But if another country was to depart that, even if Iran pulls out of it, which Iran would de facto be doing if it tested a nuclear weapon or broke out in some way, you could see a kind of domino effect where that treaty falls apart. At the moment, it's probably the best thing that we've got. There are international relations scholars like Kenneth Waltz who have argued maybe everyone should have a nuke and it's kind of balanced. Apparently, he's quite popular in Iranian universities, so I'm told from an Iranian academic friend.
I'm not sure that that's the greatest recommendation for his theories, but I just think that it's all about coordination. But I get a crucial point that you've made here, which is that we have a treaty architecture right now.
Right.
And that was established at a time when we could get along.
Yeah, exactly.
Now we all can't just get along, and therefore we can't renegotiate because the Russians will want this and the Iranians will want that and the this and the that and whatever. Therefore, the only way to contain it all getting out of control is to stick with the legal regime that we actually have now. I can see that argument.
This applies in a whole bunch of areas, and this is one of the problems because clearly there's a whole bunch of treaties and systems that really could do with being updated, but often there is a fear that if you kind of reopen the Pandora's box or the can of worms or whatever hackneyed metaphor I can use there, you'll never get anything.
And I want to point out how critical this insight is to the global enduring disorder concept. It's not that we couldn't design a better UN. It's not that we couldn't include India on the Security Council. It's that if we tweaked anything, the whole nature of the architecture of why we should have this institution falls apart. It's entropy. This is what we've got. And if we tweak even a tiny thing, no one can get along enough to renegotiate something that might be better. And the risk of having nothing is so profound that we've got to stick with the UN and the NPT and things that seem potentially out of date for the current power realities.
But then the counter argument is that they become brittle, that if you can't change anything, it is going to fall apart at some point, and that we risk mimicking an authoritarian government that says, we can't let that opposition group say anything because the whole system could collapse. So, I think it's probably right with the NPT. I just think we need to work with what's there, at least for now. But it's a real problem if we can't adapt the international system in the face of growing demands from countries that are getting richer and more vocal to be included.
Jane, wow, we've covered a lot of ground. Now is the time for us to order the disorder. It's a fairly bleak picture that we've painted, You might say that among the most important norms are those norms that keep us from being incinerated in a nuclear strike. On previous episodes of this pod, we had Kurt Volker, who was the U.S.'s ambassador to NATO and special envoy to Ukraine on the podcast. And he said, the reason NATO works is people get that they have to work together when issues of fundamental security, like not suffering nuclear annihilation, are at stake. They may not be willing to work together about things that they don't see as pressing. And they might not see carbon emissions as pressing because it's like, I'm not going to die. It's just my grandchildren. But when it comes to things that are truly pressing, Kurt said, we find ways to work together. So I hope he's right. And I hope that means that when it comes to the nuclear issue, there are fundamental ways that we can work together. How would you tell our leaders, given where we're at now, how do we work together on this nuclear issue?
Nuclear disarmament never seems pressing. And there is a pressing case for preventing nuclear war. Over time, that would be more likely if you could have functioning multilateral, gradual nuclear disarmament, or at least reducing weapons stockpiles. But it will always be hard to get that kind of urgency. I think that leaders do already get exercised about preventing an escalation between the US and Russia. I think that's been a huge priority of the Biden administration. And of course, some are criticizing them because they think it's constrained them too much over Ukraine. Maybe if you have a Trump administration, you'll have slightly more risks. They're not interested in arms control, but they don't want to provoke a nuclear war either. So I think when there's a real sense of crisis, there are some mechanisms that kick in. But you could get accidental escalation, you could get nuclear accidents, you could get, in today's world, some kind of attempts to disable or hack nuclear systems through cyber attacks that could accidentally set off a whole escalation spiral. So there needs to be a lot of vigilance. New nukes for new countries can't be part of the answer, I think.
When it comes to nukes, it's not clear to me that if the Germans have it and the South Koreans have it, that people won't be more deterred and that their adversaries might not be more deterred. I don't know South Korean and North Korean politics. Like, that is literally at the end of the universe that I study. But I am 100% open to the idea that Kim Jong-un might feel, this Trump guy, he is a complete wild card. Maybe I can get away with blowing up the South Koreans and nothing will happen. But if he thought, the South Koreans have a nuclear submarine somewhere in the Pacific, it's on automatic. Even if we decapitate their leadership, there is a 100% chance I and everyone I know and care about will be killed. I'm not sure that doesn't decrease his ability to use them, because he would know, like, the South Koreans are legit. They will blow us all up.
But we're not in a world sufficiently controlled by the West to be able to say these two Western allies are allowed their own bombs and nobody else can get them. We could imagine other examples, let's give Switzerland a bomb, probably won't hurt anybody, great. But what you will see is some kind of tit for tat from Russia and China, probably starting with Russia saying, okay, Iran, you test a nuclear weapon, that will show them. Oh, let's give Belarus some more weapons, They've already put nuclear weapons into Belarus to say, look, NATO spreads its nuclear weapons around different countries. We're doing the same. Parity, prestige, all of this kind of stuff comes in. There is a lot of experience that the world has in nuclear deterrence between pairs of countries. So specifically US and Russia and India and Pakistan. And we can't rely on that being absolutely maintained forever, but we have an idea of what balance looks like. One of the things that is destabilizing for the nuclear order is that China now wants to be up there with Russia and the US. And one of the things that leaders need to work on, and actually Trump was interested in working on but had no process to deliver it, is what does some kind of nuclear understanding or arms treaty look like when there's three countries, US, China and Russia. And there's a fundamental problem because basically the US view is China and Russia will act together, so we must have more nuclear weapons than both of them.
So, when we're ordering the disorder, we want real solutions. We want to think about ideas. So what can be done? It's very clear that you don't think that Germany or South Korea should get a bomb or even should be debating it, that it's not healthy. So what can we do?
So I'll start on nuclear, then talk about the broader security issues. So with nuclear weapons, there is a dialogue that happens between the 5 nuclear armed states where they can discuss some of the
Isn't
ways.
it like 9?
The 5 that are recognised under the non-proliferation treaty. And that's another problem, actually, because legally the others aren't recognised. There aren't any international legal mechanisms to have dialogues that include things. You have to find some other kind of messy track 2 ways to do it. But the 5, US, China, Russia, UK and France...
Which is interesting that they're exactly the same as the P5 at the UN Security Council. How
really
interesting.
It's really interesting. And they do continue to meet, despite the tensions between Russia and everybody else and the US and China. They meet regularly. At the moment, it is diplomats at a working level and the talks are not productive. But there is a process there that could be built on with political will to try to think about what the nuclear balance is going to look like. That's also a forum where they can sometimes discuss things like, shall we all agree not to use AI in our nuclear systems because that might end up with some problems? Like, that is an issue we know the US and China are discussing in a number of areas, and it is an issue for nuclear systems, among others. The NPT needs to be upheld and respected, and I think there does need to be a focus even now on some kind of nuclear diplomacy with Iran, because if Iran does weaponize, then that is going to be a real problem for the whole of the NPT. And I think that other states in the region that might themselves go nuclear if Iran does can play a role in trying to keep Iran's ambitions in check. Much bigger issues of European security. Clearly, there is a need both to try to keep the transatlantic relationship working, but also for Europe to find some kind of insurance policy. And it is going to mean more defence spending. That's going to be contentious with publics, but European countries need to think, even if Biden comes back in, there's going to have to be some way of having more self-reliance. There's a really interesting agency in Sweden that I want to learn more about called the Swedish Psychological Defence Agency, which works mainly on disinformation. But I do think personally a big part of this is about kind of societal resilience and trying to, instead of divide up our societies with culture wars, have societies where there's a general sense that we're all in it together, and if we were attacked, we would band together. As societies that are not as vulnerable to election interference and Russian propaganda and hybrid warfare.
100%. This is the issue of trust. I mean, one of the things that I'm constantly banging on about is that we can learn from countries that have more what I call social capital. So we may not have averted nuclear war, but, we've tried to hash out some ideas here. And to wrap it up, Jane, multilateral non-proliferation and disarmament laws need to be protected. We've talked a little bit about how to do this. We're going to talk more about, how to do this in future episodes. And maybe you're onto something. It's important to not respond with panic as these threats are going on, because the wrong signaling could lead to fear and could lead to maybe escalation. So what is the final solution? Keep calm and carry on?
That was exactly what was going through my head. It's a good slogan. And I think one of the problems is that, in democratic societies with lively debate and free speech, we have these great discussions, but it does mean when there's a threat that we can get into very, very public panicking, which isn't necessarily helpful. And that's when you are also in a confrontation with societies where none of those internal debates or insecurities are visible. And it can make Western countries or open societies feel that they are weak because all these debates are being had very publicly and often quite emotionally with social media, etc. So instead, they should be had on this podcast.
That seems like the perfect place to end. Thank you, Jane. And thank you, orderers, for listening. I hope you do not experience any nuclear war this week and that you have a very orderly week. If you're interested in finding out more about this topic, you can join our Substack via the link in the show notes. If you'd like to make sure that you never miss an episode, please click follow. And As always, we thank our very orderly producer, George McDonough, and our executive producer, Neil Fern. Thanks. Have a great week.